host, Melissa McKay.
Good morning and welcome to 105.9 Seaside FM. I'm Melissa McKay, your host for this installment of Focus on Pets. We're here every Thursday morning at 9 a.m. and Saturday mornings at 7:30 with conversations about pet health and responsible pet ownership. This morning, we're pleased to welcome PetWorks Pet Resort Supervisor and Coordinator of PetFocus Veterinary Group's Focus on Puppies training program, Bobbi MacInnis. Bobbi has a diploma in Advanced Canine Behavior Sciences with a focus on canine aggression, as well as a diploma in Feline Behavior Science and Technology from the Companion Animal Sciences Institute. She joins us today to talk about the concerns of social isolation, and tethering in dogs. Good morning, Bobbi. How are you?
Good morning, everyone. I am well.
Great. So, Bobbi, it seems like this is an especially timely discussion given the temperatures outside this morning. Have you been outdoors?
Yes, and it is chilly out there.
It really is. And not to say that this is the only time it's a concern. It just seems to bring it to a bit more of a light. So, some recent events have given the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture reason to draft a document titled Standards of Care for Cats and Dogs, and that's part of the Animal Protection Act. The draft addresses some general pet care requirements, some safe transportation of pets, the sale of animals, things like that, but it seems like the main focus is around pets that are left outdoors, whether it's in pens or tethered. Do you feel that there's a reason for this concern in Nova Scotia, and if so, why now?
Well, unfortunately, yes, I do. The issue has raised concern in Nova Scotia due to recent tragic events, such as the dog found frozen to death outside of a Dartmouth home, and the case of another dog abandoned and subsequently euthanized because people could not get close enough to help him.
Yeah, I think if you're on social media at all, you certainly caught wind of those stories, and that's one of the really positive things about social media is that these horrible events take a more of a front seat than they may have before, and you can't really ignore them. And so, Bobbi, there's a lot of people out there who would still argue and maintain that pets they're outdoor creatures. They're meant to be outdoors, and so what would you say to that?
Well, this traditional argument may be a bit outdated. In today's modern society, even in more rural areas, it isn't practical or safe to house pets outdoors.
Yeah, again, back to what it's like this morning, you have to think about that, and certainly life isn't quite what it was back in the 50s or even 70s from a development standpoint.
Absolutely.
Right, so safety becomes a bit of a concern for our pets that are outdoors.
Sure does. The close proximity of neighbors, traffic, other animals in the neighborhood.
Right.
All of these things.
Right. So those are some of the things you want to think about. Is there anything else that maybe makes being outdoors a bit more risky to pets?
Oh, absolutely. This is a long list. Before leaving their pet outside unsupervised, people should consider the containment and safety of the pet, their provincial and municipal laws, whether the pet is spayed or neutered, the weather, obviously. We figured that out this morning when we all got in our cars to go to work. Other animals in the neighborhood, as I've mentioned before, and the behavior and the temperament of their pet.
Right. Everyone doesn't get along like we like to think they do, right?
They do not.
That's right. And so you could end up with pets fighting and injuries and wounds, and certainly, as you said, the spread of disease is a concern.
Yes.
And some of those diseases out there can actually affect people too, right?
They can.
Absolutely, right. So that's addressing the animals that, people kind of open their door and let them go outside. What about if we talk about animals that aren't left outside to roam, but the ones that are secured in their yard, so whether it be by a fence or by a pen, lots of people have sort of long runs built in their yard, or if they're tethered. What do you think about those guys? Is there anything special that we need to think about? I mean, the draft certainly proposes some basic care requirements for pets outdoors, and can you talk a little bit about what they say about outdoor confinement for pets in terms of what what needs to be done?
Well, the proposed legislation states that the shelter in which an animal is kept must be built and maintained so as not to pose a risk to the animal's safety. It has to provide protection from the sun and the cold, be of an appropriate size for the pet. The pet's bedding must be dry and insulating. It must be located away from excrement. So it really does just set a minimum standard.
Okay, yeah. So if you address all those things and we build a lovely little shelter for our animals that are going to be outdoors, does that kind of take care of all of our concerns? Are we good to say, okay, we have this nice, lovely shelter and perfect, you can leave them outdoors?
Really, that's only half the picture. Setting the minimum standard of housing for outdoor dogs doesn't address the issue of poor socialization. A chained dog living in an insulated house is still deprived of the interaction he or she needs to be a happy pet.
So they're outside. They're, some of the things in the draft, aside from just the structure of the housing, it addresses having fresh water, so water that's not frozen, which would be a tough thing to do on a day like today, but fresh water, food, as you mentioned, the housing is away from excrement and you have nice bedding and that sort of thing, but you say that's still not enough. We have to worry about social interaction for these guys? Absolutely.
Being in an enclosure or tethered to a doghouse, these dogs do not get social interaction and really have a history of poor early socialization.
Okay. So we keep talking and bringing up this word tethering. What exactly does that mean, Bobbi?
Well, simply a tether is a rope or a chain with which an animal is tied to restrict his or her movement.
Okay, so it could be any kind of rope or chain. Is it 1 feet? Is it 5 feet?
Well, this proposed legislation attempts to be pretty specific about the length of the tether. It would have to be a minimum of 5 meters. It's also pretty specific about the type of tether. It will allow the dog to reach food and water, not be liable to get stuck or shortened, can't get wrapped around objects. So they do attempt to be specific about the length and type of tether.
Okay, but the law is still saying that it's okay to tether your dog, is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes, they are putting time constraints on that. This new law proposes that tethering happen for only a 12-hour period with a 7-hour break in between.
Okay.
So they attempt to be pretty specific about the type, the timing, the length of the tether. But again, we're looking at a minimum requirement.
Right. So, as a dog trainer and someone who's been in this field for quite a number of years now, do you think that tethering dogs is abusing dogs?
Well, the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association includes emotional abuse and neglect in their definition of animal abuse. CVMA has also gone on to say that tethering of dogs as a primary method of confinement is not acceptable.
So the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association says that this is not a good thing and actually classifies it as abuse because of the neglect. That's
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so what about the people who say, but I put my dog frou-frou out on the chain in the yard and I hook it up to the clothesline and she whips up and down the yard and has a blast and gets great exercise and, am I being neglectful when I do that?
Well, the reality is that most dogs will not exercise without some sort of interaction. Dogs tethered on a clothesline quickly learn that barking and pacing, running around the yard, when something unfamiliar is near, quickly, makes things that they cannot see or may be afraid of go away. This can ignite a bit of a noisy cycle that can drive your neighbor's batty and lead to a high level of anxiety for the pet. There really is no substitute for exercise and interaction between dog and owner.
Right. So that's a really good point that people maybe aren't thinking about when they think about tethering, and we tend to focus on, the elements or the isolation, but the social nuisance is something that maybe makes some other people stand up and take listen that aren't necessarily dog lovers themselves, but certainly like their peace and quiet or enjoy their patio time. And so you say that, putting them out there for exercise isn't really beneficial if you're not going to be out there to exercise with them?
Absolutely. I always say to our clients that, a dog that's out in the backyard is really up to no good by themselves. They're either digging holes. It's very difficult for them to amuse themselves in the backyard. And I tell clients, go out and stand in your backyard yourself for a few minutes, and without gardening or mowing the lawn or having some sort of interaction, it really is quite boring.
Right. And I think a lot of people who are opposed to the tethering law would pose the same argument in regards to people trying it on for size and say, go out and have yourself tethered in the yard for hours on end with no interaction. And it's not even really fair to say hours on end, because for a lot of these animals, we're talking about days and weeks and months on end, right? Yeah. So you can appreciate that if you, as a person, were forced to maybe sit in a room that's completely bare other than someone putting food in once in a while, and you had no interaction of any kind, you'd be pretty bored and upset. And so what happens to dogs when they're bored? What tends to happen?
Generally, they find things to amuse themselves, and I can guarantee most times that's not washing the car or mowing the lawn.
Right. So destructive behaviors, right? Destructive
behaviors, digging. You get into a cycle of, say, chasing away the mailman. You can get barrier aggression, aggressive behavior from behind a barrier. Because, again, as I go back to what I was saying earlier, if somebody happens to pass by a fence and the dog is unfamiliar with that person or that animal, they bark, their level of anxiety goes up, and unfortunately they learn that when they exhibit this behavior, whatever is on the other side of the barrier usually quickly leaves. So unfortunately, the next time they are approached, they revert to the same behavior to get the end result. So it becomes a bit of a cycle.
Right, and there have been, I think, Bobbi, some arguments made that tethering should be approached from a public safety standpoint. And so what's the public safety concern here?
Really, the public safety concern is the aggressive behavior issue. Poor socialization for these dogs early on in life. Anything that a dog has not been exposed to early on in their puppyhood, they view as a possible threat. They're afraid of it. And unfortunately, a lot of these dogs, because of the lack of interaction, view humans as something that they should fear. And this becomes really dangerous when it's an adult human, but it becomes tragic when it involves children.
Right. Yeah, and you can't go back once that's done, eh? And once they miss their socialization period, it's really hard to go back as well. Is that correct?
It becomes very, very difficult. Sadly, the prognosis for these dogs can be pretty grim.
So on that point, what happens if someone goes in and rescues one of these dogs? Is it possible to successfully recondition or retrain and rehome a dog that's been severely emotionally neglected, as these tethered dogs and dogs outdoors often are?
Behaviorally, these dogs can present such a challenge to their new owners, and in some cases, again, especially if the household has children, they can be dangerous.
Right.
These poorly socialized dogs lack the skills required to live in a home, and it can take many hours of rehabilitation with an animal behavior expert to recondition and retrain them.
And thankfully, we have a lot of wonderful animal rescues out there that are working hard to see these dogs in a safe, loving home, and we have lots of wonderful fosters that work through these rescue organizations that work with these guys, but it certainly poses a challenge, and the expectation should be that there's going to be a lot of work put in. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It is definitely a challenge that it takes work, it takes commitment. It certainly does take a special touch, that's for sure.
So the provincial government appears to be trying to make a distinction between humane and inhumane tethering, and so the proposed guidelines that you mentioned earlier, the maximum 12-hour stretch on a tether with a minimum 7-hour break, does that make this humane tethering in your opinion?
Well, again, we have to be clear. They're trying to impose a minimum standard. This minimum standard fails to address the animal's emotional welfare. The bottom line is that tethering, whether it's for 1 hour or 12 hours, can cause many behavior problems, and it's generally a bad idea.
So, Bobbi, what can animal lovers do if they want to have a voice in this?
Well, the provincial government says it will seek public feedback on the proposals through the Nova Scotia Agricultural Department's website by March 31st, so you can go online and check that out and contact your local representatives to give you feedback. If you happen to see a pet that you feel is being neglected, if you feel comfortable, speak with the animal's owner. Okay. Let them know that you're concerned about the animal's well-being and provide them with information about the risks for these outdoor dogs.
That's wonderful, Bobbi. Well, our time is coming to an end again today, and I want to thank Bobbi MacInnis of PetFocus Veterinary Group for shedding some light on this really important subject. And letting us recognize that everyone should be concerned about tethering in dogs and what we can do to have a voice, and we urge you to make your voice heard and help these animals who can't speak for themselves. We're here every Thursday morning at Seaside FM 105.9 and again Saturdays at 7:30. Thanks for joining us, Bob.